What if there were two Earths in the solar system? At first, it was only a flicker on distant telescopes, a strange blue echo drifting along a neighboring orbit, dismissed as reflection, distortion, or wishful thinking, until night after night it returned, clearer, sharper, undeniably real. A second sphere, wrapped in clouds and oceans, gliding silently through the dark, mirroring the very world beneath the observer's feet. And when the realization settled across humanity, it did not arrive with panic, but with a quiet, breathless awe, as if the universe had whispered a secret it had been keeping since the beginning of time. And soon the skies themselves began to change, because as the second Earth drew closer in its long, patient orbit, it became visible not just through instruments, but to the naked eye, first as a bright wandering star, then as a glowing disk, then as a vast presence hanging in the heavens, its continents faintly visible, its storms swirling like living brushstrokes. And people stood in streets, on rooftops, in empty fields, staring upward at a world that looked hauntingly, impossibly familiar, a reflection that felt intimate and alien, and questions multiplied faster than answers. Because if this was another Earth, then what did it mean for everything humanity believed about its place in the cosmos? And more unsettling still, was it truly identical or only a near-perfect illusion? And so the great observatories turned their full attention toward it, mapping its surface, tracking its oceans, analyzing the faint spectral signatures of its atmosphere. And what they found sent a ripple of unease through even the most disciplined minds. Because the second Earth did not just resemble their own, it matched it with uncanny precision. The same continents, the same mountain ranges, the same swirling weather systems, even the same patterns of light flickering faintly along its night side, as though cities existed there too, shining across an immeasurable gulf of space. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether there was another Earth, but whether there were other people, other lives unfolding in parallel. And as the distance between the two worlds shrank, communication attempts began, signals transmitted across the void, carefully encoded messages sent in pulses of radio waves, mathematical sequences, greetings, hopes, fears. And for a long time there was only silence, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the planet itself, until one night the silence broke and a signal returned, faint at first, then unmistakable, mirroring the original transmission with slight variations, like a voice echoing through a canyon but choosing its own words. And when the scientists decoded it, they found not randomness, not noise, but intent, a response that acknowledged their existence, their presence, their attempt to reach out. And in that moment, the distance between the two Earths seemed to collapse into something far smaller than space, something that could be bridged by thought, by curiosity, by a shared recognition of self. And yet as the exchange continued, patterns emerged that were subtly, disturbingly different, because the responses were not identical reflections, but evolved answers, as if the other Earth had walked a path similar but not the same, histories diverging at unseen crossroads, technologies advancing in different directions, philosophies shaped by choices never made on this side. And with each message, the sense of wonder deepened, but so did the tension, because the closer the two worlds drifted, the more their gravitational pull began to affect one another, tides rising higher, orbital paths bending in delicate but measurable ways. And the realization grew that this encounter was not just philosophical, but physical, that two worlds so alike could not share the same space forever without consequence. And debates ignited across every nation, every institution, every mind capable of imagining the future, some seeing an unprecedented opportunity for exchange, for unity across worlds, others fearing collision, catastrophe, the destruction of both planets in a cosmic inevitability that could not be negotiated or reasoned with. And as the days passed, the second Earth grew larger in the sky, filling it with a presence that turned night into a surreal twilight, casting a pale, shifting glow across oceans and forests and cities alike, until it felt less like looking at another world and more like standing before a mirror that reflected not just what was, but what could have been. And in that reflection, people began to see not only similarities, but differences, subtle at first, then undeniable, coastlines that curved just a little differently,
storms that spiraled in unfamiliar patterns, lights that flickered in places where there should have been darkness, and the understanding dawned that this was not a duplicate but a variation, a sibling born of the same cosmic conditions but shaped by different moments, different choices, different fates. And as the two Earths approached their closest point, close enough that their gravitational embrace could be felt in the trembling of the ground and the restless surge of the seas, a final transmission was sent, not of data or analysis, but of something simpler, something older, a message carried in the universal language of existence itself, a question that needed no translation, asking who they were, why they existed, and what would happen when two versions of the same world finally faced one another in the vast, silent theater of space. And the reply that came back was not a warning, not a plea, but a recognition, a quiet affirmation that across the void, across the infinite possibilities of time and choice, they had both arrived at this moment together, not as enemies or reflections, but as two paths converging. And as the skies shimmered with the presence of the other Earth, humanity stood at the edge of an answer that would redefine everything it had ever known, waiting to see whether the meeting of worlds would become a collision of fate or the beginning of something entirely new.
And as the two worlds hovered in that fragile balance, suspended in a gravitational dance so precise it felt intentional, the silence between them deepened into something almost sacred, broken only by the steady exchange of signals that now flowed constantly across the void, no longer cautious or hesitant, but rich with detail, images, sounds, fragments of lives unfolding on the other Earth. And people gathered everywhere to watch as the first true transmissions were decoded into moving pictures, revealing cities both familiar and strange, skylines that echoed known shapes yet diverged in subtle architecture, oceans crossed by vessels unlike any built on this side, and faces, human faces, looking back through the darkness with the same mixture of wonder and disbelief, confirming at last what had only been imagined, that they were not alone, not even in their own likeness. And for a time, the fear that had gripped the world began to soften, replaced by an overwhelming curiosity, a desire to understand how two worlds so similar could have grown apart in ways both small and profound. And soon, joint projects emerged, synchronized efforts between scientists on both planets to model the future of their shared orbit, to predict whether their paths would stabilize into a long-term resonance or drift toward inevitable catastrophe. And the results were both hopeful and terrifying, because while the immediate future showed no collision, the long arc of time revealed a slow convergence, a tightening spiral that, over years or decades, would bring them dangerously close unless something intervened. And so the dialogue shifted from observation to action, from asking who they were to asking what could be done. And ideas once confined to fiction were suddenly treated as urgent necessities, proposals to alter planetary trajectories, to deploy massive gravitational tugs, to construct engines capable of nudging entire worlds onto safer paths. And what made it possible at all was not just the technology of one Earth, but the combined ingenuity of two, their differences becoming strengths, complementary solutions woven together into plans that neither could have conceived alone. And yet, beneath the surface of cooperation, there lingered a deeper question that no equation could answer, because as more was learned about the other Earth, its history began to emerge in fragments, revealing a timeline that mirrored their own up to a certain point and then diverged sharply. A war that had never happened here, a discovery that had never been made there, entire cultures shaped by events that existed only on one side of reality. And with that knowledge came a strange and unsettling awareness that each world represented not just a place, but a possibility, a version of humanity defined by its choices. And as people studied the other Earth, they could not help but compare, to wonder whether their own path had been better or worse, whether the other had avoided mistakes or made new ones. And the line between curiosity and judgment began to blur, creating tensions that no amount of scientific collaboration could fully erase.
and still the two planets continued their slow approach, their presence in each other's skies now so immense that nights were filled with shifting shadows cast by continents floating above, clouds illuminated from both sides, oceans reflecting not one but two worlds at once, creating a sense that reality itself had doubled, expanded beyond its previous boundaries. And in that strange new existence, people began to change, their sense of identity stretching to include not just their own planet, but the idea of another self, another humanity watching from across the void. And some embraced it, forming movements that celebrated the unity of the two Earths, while others resisted, clinging to the belief that their world must remain distinct, separate, protected. And as these opposing views grew stronger, the leaders of both planets faced a decision that would define the future of both civilizations, because the models had reached a critical conclusion. The gravitational dance would soon become unstable, and within a narrow window there existed a chance to alter their paths permanently, to push the worlds apart into stable orbits that would preserve them both, but end their close proximity forever. Or to do nothing and allow the natural convergence to continue, risking an unknown outcome that could lead to unprecedented contact or unimaginable destruction. And in that moment, the question was no longer about physics or engineering, but about choice, about whether two versions of the same world should remain distant observers or become something more intertwined. And the final transmissions before the decision carried a weight unlike anything sent before, not data or plans, but reflections, messages from individuals on both Earths, sharing their thoughts, their hopes, their fears, creating a tapestry of voices that spanned not just one planet, but two. And as those messages filled the airwaves, echoing across space, it became clear that whatever happened next would not simply be the meeting of worlds, but the merging or separation of entire histories. And when the moment arrived, when the engines designed to shift the course of planets stood ready, when the calculations aligned and the window opened, both Earths acted, not in perfect unison, but in harmony, choosing a path that would preserve the delicate balance between connection and survival. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the distance between them began to grow, their gravitational grip loosening, their skies dimming as the other world receded from overwhelming presence to distant brilliance. And though the separation carried a quiet ache, a sense of something vast slipping away, it also brought stability, a future in which both Earths could continue, forever changed by the knowledge of each other, forever marked by the brief moment when two versions of humanity had looked across the cosmos and recognized themselves. And as the second Earth became once again a bright wandering star in the sky, its details fading but its existence undeniable, the people of both worlds carried forward not just the memory of that encounter, but the understanding that they were part of something far greater than a single path, that somewhere, out there, beyond the reach of their hands, but never beyond the reach of their thoughts, another Earth continued its journey. A reminder that every choice creates a new world, and that even in the vast emptiness of space, no world is truly alone.
And yet, even as the distance widened and the two worlds drifted back into separate orbits, something subtle refused to fade, a lingering connection that could not be measured by instruments or plotted on charts. Because the communication did not cease, it evolved, becoming slower as the signal delay stretched, but deeper, more deliberate, as if both civilizations understood that every message now carried more weight, more meaning. And across the growing void, they began to exchange not just knowledge, but culture, stories, music, fragments of art and language that revealed the soul of each world. And what emerged was not a sense of division, but a quiet, expanding realization that they were no longer two isolated planets, but parts of a shared narrative, two threads woven into a single, unimaginable tapestry stretching across space. And over years, the memory of the near encounter transformed from a moment of tension into a foundation for something new, a joint history that neither side could claim alone. and children grew up under skies where a distant blue star was no longer just a point of light, but a place, a home to people who laughed and dreamed and wondered in ways both familiar and strange. And entire generations were shaped by that awareness, their sense of identity no longer confined to a single world, but extended outward into the vastness between them. And as technology advanced, the idea of physical contact returned, no longer driven by urgency or fear, but by curiosity and purpose. Plans were drawn for vessels that could traverse the immense distance, journeys that would take decades, perhaps lifetimes, but which now felt possible because both Earths worked together, combining their knowledge, refining propulsion systems, creating sustainable habitats capable of carrying human life across the silent Gulf. And the first of these ships, built in collaboration between the two worlds, became a symbol of what their brief closeness had made possible, a testament to the idea that even when separated by space, connection could endure. And when it finally launched, rising from the surface of one Earth while watched by billions on both, it carried not just explorers, but representatives of a shared humanity. Individuals chosen not for their strength or intellect alone, but for their ability to understand, to bridge the subtle differences that defined the two worlds. And as the ship disappeared into the darkness, beginning its long journey toward the distant twin, people stood once again under the night sky. But this time, the feeling was different, no longer defined by uncertainty or fear, but by a quiet confidence that the connection between the two Earths would not be lost. And as years turned into decades and the signal from the ship continued to reach back across space, carrying updates, observations, moments of discovery, it became clear that the journey itself was as important as the destination, because it proved that the bond formed during that brief cosmic encounter had not only survived but grown stronger, transcending distance. And when at last the explorers approached the second Earth, its blue glow filling their view just as it once had filled the sky of their own world, they saw not a mirror, but a counterpart, a place shaped by different choices, yet bound by the same origins. And as they descended through its atmosphere, greeted by the people who had once been only distant voices, the story of the two Earths reached a new beginning, not as a question or a possibility, but as a reality lived by those who stepped onto a world that was both foreign and deeply familiar. And far behind them, on both planets, countless eyes looked up at the sky, knowing that the distance between the two Earths was no longer defined by emptiness, but by a path that had been crossed, a connection that would continue to shape their future in ways still unfolding. And in that understanding, there was a profound peace, a sense that the universe was not a place of isolation, but of infinite variation, where even the most unlikely reflections could meet, learn, and move forward together, forever changed by the simple, extraordinary truth that somewhere out there, another version of home existed, and it answered when called. And long after the first travelers set foot upon that distant twin, and the two worlds established a steady exchange of knowledge, people, and stories, the meaning of that discovery continued to unfold in ways no one had predicted. Because the existence of another Earth did not simply expand humanity's reach across space, it transformed its understanding of itself, dissolving the idea that any single history was absolute and replacing it with the awareness that reality could branch, diverge, and still remain connected. And as scholars from both planets compared their records, their sciences, their philosophies, they began to notice patterns that suggested something even more profound. Small coincidences that aligned too precisely to be random, moments where both worlds had arrived at similar discoveries independently, not at the same time, but in the same sequence, as though guided by an underlying structure woven into the fabric of existence itself. And this realization sparked a new field of study that reached beyond physics and beyond philosophy, an attempt to understand whether the two Earths were isolated anomalies or part of a larger system, a network of possible worlds branching from shared origins. And with each new insight, the question grew larger. Because if two such worlds could exist within one solar system, then perhaps the universe was filled with echoes, variations of reality unfolding in parallel, some close enough to touch, others forever beyond reach. And this idea changed how people looked at the sky, not as a void scattered with distant lights, but as a vast, layered structure where every star might hold not just planets, but possibilities. And yet, for all its grandeur, the connection between the two Earths remained deeply personal, rooted in the relationships formed between individuals who crossed the distance and found themselves face to face with versions of humanity shaped by different paths. Friendships formed, families grew, and in some cases, people met others who resembled them so closely it blurred the boundary between coincidence and something deeper, not identical, not reflections, but echoes, lives that had taken similar turns until diverging at some unseen moment. And those encounters carried a quiet intensity, a recognition that could not be explained but could be felt, a sense that identity itself was more fluid than anyone had imagined. And as time passed, the exchange between the two worlds became a normal part of life, ships traveling back and forth along established routes, carrying goods, ideas, and people across the once unimaginable distance, turning what had been a cosmic anomaly into a living connection. And still, the memory of that first approach, that moment when the second Earth filled the sky and forced humanity to confront its own reflection, remained a defining chapter in their shared history, a reminder of how fragile and extraordinary their existence was. And in quiet moments, when the skies were clear and the distant twin shone softly among the stars, people would pause and look up, not with the shock and disbelief of the past, but with a calm, enduring awareness that they were part of something far larger than a single world, a single timeline, or a single story. And in that awareness, there was both humility and hope, because it meant that no matter how vast the universe might be, it was also filled with connections waiting to be discovered, and that even in the infinite expanse of space, the question of who we are could never be answered by looking at only one world, but only by recognizing the countless paths that exist alongside our own. And as the two Earths continued their journeys around the same star, separated by distance, yet bound by shared origin and experience, their story did not end or resolve into a single conclusion, but instead expanded outward, becoming a living testament to the idea that existence itself is not a fixed point, but a spectrum of possibilities, and that somewhere between those possibilities lies the truth that every world, every life, and every choice is part of a greater whole, a vast and ever-evolving reality in which even the most improbable meeting of two identical worlds can become the beginning of something that stretches far beyond the limits of imagination, carrying forward into a future where the boundaries between separate paths grow thinner, and the understanding of what it means to belong is no longer confined to a single place, but shared across the silent, infinite distances that once seemed impossible to cross.